Hugh de Payens. Hugh de Payens, the co-founder and first Grand Master of the Knights Templar, died in 1136, after approximately 18 years, leading the order he built from nothing. And he did something almost no major Templar leader after him managed to do. He died in bed. That quiet, unremarkable death stands as one of the most striking contrasts in the entire history of the order, because the institution Hugh created would go on to consume nearly everyone who led it, chewing through Grand Masters in battles, sieges, and eventually on a burning scaffold in Paris. Hugh had arrived in Jerusalem around 1119 with a small band of knights, perhaps 8 or 9 in total, and convinced King Baldwin II to grant them quarters on the Temple Mount, the Templum Salomonis, from which the order took its name. The early years were austere almost beyond belief. The knights were so poor that 2 men reportedly shared a single horse, an image that became the iconic symbol on the Templar seal. Hugh spent the next decade and a half transforming that tiny brotherhood into a papally recognized military order, traveling to Europe in 1127 to recruit members and lobby for institutional legitimacy, which he secured at the Council of Troyes in 1129 with the formal approval of the Templar rule, drafted with the help of Bernard of Clairvaux. By the time Hugh died, he had turned a handful of knights guarding pilgrims into something Europe had never quite seen before, a permanent standing military force answerable directly to the Pope. His burial location remains uncertain, with some sources suggesting a site near Jerusalem and others placing him at a Templar preceptory in Europe, but the historical record does not confirm it clearly. What the record does confirm is that the man who launched 2 centuries of Templar history exited it gently, leaving behind an institution that most of its future leaders would not be so lucky to outlive. Robert de Craon. Robert de Craon, the second Grand Master of the Knights Templar, died in 1149 of natural causes, and like his predecessor, he departed without a sword wound to show for it, though his contribution to the Order's power was arguably just as foundational as anything accomplished on a battlefield. Where Hugh de Payens built the Order's identity, Robert built its legal armor. In 1139, he secured from Pope Innocent II the papal bull known as Omni Datum Optimum, a document that transformed the Templars from a respected military brotherhood into something closer to a sovereign institution operating within the Church, but largely above the reach of local bishops and kings. The bull exempted Templars from paying tithes, allowed them to build their own churches, and crucially placed them under the direct authority of the Pope alone, meaning no local bishop could discipline them, no local lord could tax them, and no regional church could interfere with their operations. It was an extraordinary legal achievement, the kind that redrew power maps without a single cavalry charge. Robert's tenure as Grand Master from 1136 to 1149 also overlapped with the Second Crusade, the massive and ultimately disastrous campaign launched in response to the fall of Edessa in 1144. The Templars participated in that campaign, and Robert's leadership helped stabilize the Order's military role during a period of enormous strategic pressure. His death came at the end of a tenure defined more by institutional architecture than by personal heroism, but the structure he built, legally untouchable, directly papal, financially privileged, would give the Order the muscle to operate as a trans-European power for the next century and a half. The cause of his death is not precisely recorded, and no contemporary source describes the circumstances in dramatic detail, which is itself telling. He was an administrator and a diplomat who died as one. Everard des Barres. Everard des Barres achieved something almost unique among Templar Grand Masters. He left the job voluntarily, walked into a monastery, and died there roughly 2 decades later in 1174, having traded the white mantle of a Templar knight for the habit of a Cistercian monk. He served as Grand Master from 1149 to 1152, and his tenure was defined almost entirely by the Second Crusade, specifically by witnessing its catastrophic collapse at the Siege of Damascus in July 1148, a campaign so badly coordinated and so thoroughly undermined by political infighting among the Crusader leaders that it ended in humiliating retreat after just 4 days of actual siege operations. Everard had been closely attached to King Louis VII of France throughout the Crusade, and his organizational ability reportedly helped keep the French army functional during the long, brutal march through Anatolia, where Crusaders died in enormous numbers from Turkish ambushes and starvation. Contemporary accounts suggest Louis VII had significant personal respect for him. But whatever Everard experienced during the Second Crusade, the waste, the death, the political cynicism that turned a holy war into a diplomatic embarrassment, appears to have broken something in him spiritually. Within 3 years of the campaign's failure, he resigned the Grand Mastership, an act with almost no parallel in the Order's history, and entered the Cistercian Order, whose founder, Bernard of Clairvaux, had been instrumental in giving the Templars their rule and their theological identity. The precise circumstances of his death around 1174 are not well documented, and no dramatic scene attaches to it. He was simply a man who had seen enough of the world's violence, decided the sword was not his vocation after all, and spent his final years in the quiet rhythm of monastic life, prayer, silence, and the slow passing of time, far from Jerusalem. Gerard de Riedfort. Gerard de Riedfort died at the Siege of Acre in 1189, killed in a sortie outside the city walls, and while that death sounds honorable enough for a Grand Master of the Templars, it came at the end of a career so catastrophically destructive that many historians hold him personally responsible for the single greatest military disaster in the history of the Crusader states. De Riedfort became Grand Master in 1185, and within 2 years had helped engineer the conditions for the Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187. A defeat so total, so irreversible, that it effectively ended Christian military control of the Holy Land for generations. The background involves a succession crisis in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and a critical strategic debate when Saladin's forces besieged Tiberias. Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most experienced Crusader commanders alive, argued that the army should hold its position and not march across the waterless plateau of Galilee in July. He pointed out that Saladin was baiting them and that the heat and lack of water would destroy any army that took the bait. De Riedfort, driven by personal animosity toward Raymond and an almost reckless confidence, pushed King Guy of Lusignan to march. The army marched. Over 2 days of thirst, exhaustion, and relentless Seljuk harassment, the Crusader force collapsed on the volcanic hillsides called the Horns of Hattin. Saladin's forces surrounded them completely. The True Cross, which the Crusaders had carried into battle as a spiritual guarantee of divine protection, was captured. Somewhere between 200 and 230 Templar and Hospitaller prisoners were executed by Saladin's order after the battle, beheaded by Sufi volunteers who reportedly competed for the honor. De Riedfort himself was captured but ransomed, a decision by Saladin whose rationale historians still debate, while his knights died around him. Jerusalem fell on October 2nd, 1187. De Riedfort returned to lead the Templars again, which is itself remarkable, and met his end 2 years later outside Acre, reportedly killed when a sortie beyond the city walls went wrong. The exact method of his death varies by source. Some say beheaded, some say killed in combat, but the manner matters less than the legacy. The man who helped lose Jerusalem died fighting, which was more than some thought he deserved. Robert de Sablé. Robert de Sablé died in 1193, most likely of illness, after a tenure as Grand Master, defined by one of the most famous rearguard actions in medieval military history and one of the stranger real estate transactions the Crusades ever produced. De Sablé was appointed Grand Master in 1191, nominated to the position with the active support of King Richard I of England, with whom he had strong ties. He had sailed with Richard's fleet on the Third Crusade. That same year, Richard sold the island of Cyprus to the Templars for 100,000 BC after capturing it from the Byzantine ruler Isaac Komnenos. The Templars, finding the island expensive to garrison and its population hostile, eventually sold it back to Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king of Jerusalem, but for a brief and historically peculiar period, the Knights Templar owned an entire island kingdom. De Sablé's more purely military moment came at the Battle of Arsuf, on September 7th, 1191, when the Crusader army marching down the coast of Palestine toward Jaffa was subjected to hours of relentless Mamluk and Seljuk cavalry harassment, designed to break their formation and provoke a premature charge. The Templars held the rearguard, the most exposed, most punished position in the column, and maintained their discipline under repeated waves of arrows and cavalry strikes, with a steadiness that contemporary chroniclers specifically praised. When the charge finally came, it helped shatter Saladin's force and produce one of Richard's most complete battlefield victories. De Sablé died roughly 2 years later, and though the precise cause is not clearly documented in surviving sources, illness was the most common killer of Crusaders in the East, cutting down men that no army could touch. His death was quiet compared to what the role would increasingly demand of those who followed him. Gilbert Horal. Gilbert Horal died in 1200 of natural causes, and the most striking thing about his tenure as Grand Master from 1193 to 1200 is how deliberately unglamorous it was. He inherited the order in the aftermath of the Third Crusade's inconclusive end. Richard I had won battles but not Jerusalem, and the Crusader states were a diminished, fractured version of what they had been before Hattin. The Treaty of Jaffa in September 1192 had secured a 3-year truce with Saladin and guaranteed Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites, but it was a negotiated settlement, not a victory, and the order Horal led was smaller, poorer and more strategically vulnerable than it had been a decade earlier. His years as Grand Master were largely consumed with the unglamorous but essential work of rebuilding, recruiting new knights in Europe, restoring depleted finances, reinforcing Templar castles along the coast, and maintaining the Order's political relationships with the fractious nobility of what remained of the Crusader states. None of this produced the kind of dramatic episode that gets written into chronicles. Harald was a man of maintenance, not conquest, and he died in 1200, leaving behind an order that was at least functional, solvent, and still standing, which, given everything that had happened in the previous 15 years, was itself an achievement. The surviving sources say very little about the circumstances of his death, which is itself a kind of summary of his tenure. Philip du Plessis. Philip du Plessis served as Grand Master from 1201 to 1209 and died of natural causes, but his years leading the order coincided with an event so damaging to the entire concept of the crusading movement that its shadow fell over everything the Templars attempted for the remainder of their existence. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, was supposed to strike Egypt and cut off the Ayyubid Sultanate's strategic base. Instead, through a series of financial obligations, political maneuvers, and the ambitions of the Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo, it ended with the crusading army sacking Constantinople in April 1204, the capital of Christian Byzantium, the city that had been the eastern bulwark of Christendom for centuries, looted and burned by men who had taken the cross in the name of God. The Templars were not significantly involved in this diversion. They maintained their focus on the Holy Land and kept their forces in the east. But the Fourth Crusade's catastrophe fractured the moral and political unity that the crusading ideal depended on, and it weakened Byzantium so comprehensively that the empire never fully recovered, a wound that would have long-term consequences for Christian resistance to Islamic expansion in the east. Du Plessis navigated all of this from a position of organizational steadiness, keeping the order oriented toward its original mission while the broader crusading world descended into chaos and self-interest. His death in 1209 went unrecorded in any dramatic way, which places him firmly in the category of Grand Masters who held the line without the line holding them back. William of Chartres. William of Chartres died of illness in 1219 during or immediately following the siege of Damietta in Egypt, which means he was killed not by any enemy blade, but by the invisible army of infection and disease that haunted every major medieval siege and killed more crusaders than Saladin and his successors combined. He had been Grand Master since 1210 and led the Templars into the Fifth Crusade, the ambitious campaign launched under papal pressure to finally retake Jerusalem by striking at Egypt's heart. The siege of Damietta, which began in May 1218, was a prolonged and grinding operation fought on the flat, swampy Nile Delta, terrain that bred disease with terrifying efficiency. The Crusader camp became a reservoir of dysentery, scurvy, and other illnesses as the siege stretched across months and then years. Notable figures died in the camp, including the papal legate's authority over the operation, and the military command fractured repeatedly over strategy. William of Chartres died in this environment, his body defeated by something he could neither fight nor flee. There is a particular grimness to dying of fever in a siege camp on the Egyptian coast after years of building an order, training men, managing the immense political complexity of the Crusader states, and then losing not to any of those forces but to contaminated water or bad air. Damietta finally fell in November 1219, months after William's death, but the Fifth Crusade's broader ambitions collapsed by 1221 when a poorly timed advance down the Nile allowed the Egyptians to cut off and force the surrender of the entire Crusader force. William of Chartres died before the victory, before the failure, and his absence may have contributed to both. Peter de Montaigu. Peter de Montaigu died in 1232 after 13 years as Grand Master, one of the longer tenures of the period, and the defining episode of his leadership was not a battle he fought, but a peace treaty he refused to support, signed by an excommunicated emperor who had technically achieved what the Crusades had been trying to accomplish for decades. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II arrived in the Holy Land in 1228, despite being under papal excommunication for repeatedly delaying his crusading vow, and proceeded to negotiate the Treaty of Jaffa directly with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil in February 1229. The treaty returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control for 10 years, along with a land corridor to the coast, achieved entirely through diplomacy, without a single major engagement. The Templars and Hospitallers were furious. De Montaigu refused to participate in or support the treaty, and his reasons were both theological and practical. Frederick was excommunicated, making his entire enterprise spiritually compromised in the Church's eyes, and the military orders understood that a negotiated settlement with a 10-year clock attached was not a strategic solution. They were right. Jerusalem would be lost again, permanently, within 15 years. De Montagu's position put him in direct conflict with one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, a man who was simultaneously Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and King of Jerusalem by right of marriage, and who reportedly threatened the Templars directly during his time in the Holy Land. De Montaigu survived all of it and died of natural causes in 1232, which given the circumstances represents a kind of quiet defiance. Armand de Périgord. Armand de Périgord led the Templars into one of the worst military catastrophes in their history, the Battle of La Fourby on October 17th and 18th, 1244, and his precise fate afterward remains one of the genuine historical mysteries of the crusading era. He had been Grand Master since 1232, and his tenure saw the acceleration of the order's strategic deterioration. In August 1244, the Khwarezmian Turks, mercenary forces unleashed by the Ayyubid Sultan as Salih, sacked Jerusalem, slaughtering Christian inhabitants and desecrating the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Jerusalem, already lost once, then briefly recovered through Frederick II's treaty, was now gone again, and this time the loss was violent. 2 months later, the combined force of Crusader Knights, Templars, Hospitallers, and allied Ayyubid Muslim factions faced the Khwarezmians and their Egyptian allies on the plains near Gaza. The battle was a complete annihilation. Contemporary sources estimate that somewhere between 300 and 400 Templar Knights rode into that engagement. Approximately 33 survived. The Hospitaller losses were similarly catastrophic, and the broader Crusader alliance essentially ceased to exist as a functioning military force after La Fourby. What happened to de Périgord himself is unclear. Some accounts suggest he was captured and died in Egyptian captivity. Others indicate he may have been killed during the battle itself. The historical record does not settle the question definitively, and no reliable contemporary source provides a clear account of his end. What is certain is that, after La Fourby, he disappeared from history, and the order he led never truly recovered the military capacity it had possessed before that October plain swallowed most of its knights. William de Sonnac. William de Sonnac lost an eye on February 8, 1250, at the Battle of Mansoura, fought in the burning streets of an Egyptian town during King Louis IX of France's ill-fated 7th Crusade, and then, with one eye gone and his face still damaged by Greek fire, he went back into battle 3 days later and died. That sequence of events tells you almost everything you need to know about what being a Templar Grand Master in the 13th century actually meant. De Sonnac had been Grand Master since 1247 and had seen enough of the crusading pattern to understand how these campaigns tended to end. But he led the Templar contingent into Mansoura anyway when Count Robert of Artois, the king's brother, charged rashly into the town against specific orders and dragged the cavalry with him. Inside the narrow streets, the Crusader Knights found the Mamluk forces waiting in organized resistance. The pursuit turned into a massacre, with horses unable to maneuver and knights cut down in confined alleyways. De Sonnac was struck by Greek fire in the face. Accounts describe burning pitch and debris destroying his eye, and the Templar losses at Mansoura were enormous, with some estimates suggesting hundreds of knights killed in a single afternoon. Contemporary chronicler Jean de Joinville, who was present on the campaign and knew the participants personally, recorded the scale of the disaster in detail. De Sonnac returned to the fighting on February 11th at the Battle of Fariscourt, still wounded, and was killed there. Louis IX himself was captured in April, ransomed for an enormous sum, and the 7th Crusade ended as a military failure. De Sonnac died the way the ideal Templar Knight was supposed to die, fighting, wounded, refusing to stop, and the tragedy is that none of it mattered strategically. The Crusade was already lost. Thomas Berard. Thomas Berard died of natural causes in 1273 after 17 years as Grand Master, which made him one of the longest-serving leaders in the Order's final period, and the world he watched from that position was one in which the foundations of the Crusader presence in the Near East were being systematically demolished. His tenure began in 1256 and ran through some of the most turbulent decades in medieval Near Eastern history. The Mongol invasions under Hulagu Khan swept through Baghdad in 1258, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate in a catastrophe that reshaped Islamic civilization, and the Mongol forces advanced toward Palestine with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Then, on September 3, 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Galilee, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars defeated the Mongols, the first significant Mongol military defeat, and in doing so established the Mamluks as the dominant military power in the region. For the Crusader states, the Mongol-Mamluk dynamic was a complex political landscape to navigate, with various Templar commanders at different points, maintaining cautious neutrality or limited cooperation with Mongol forces, while facing the Mamluks as their primary existential threat. Baybars, who became sultan after assassinating Qutuz, launched a systematic campaign to eliminate the remaining Crusader fortresses, taking Caesarea in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, and Antioch, one of the original and most important Crusader cities, in 1268. Berard watched the map shrink around him, fortress by fortress, and died in 1273, with the coastline of the Crusader states reduced to a narrow strip. His natural death, quiet and undocumented, is almost surreal against that backdrop. Guillaume de Beaujeu. Guillaume de Beaujeu was killed on May 18th, 1291, on the walls of Acre, the last major city of the Crusader states, struck by a Mamluk projectile, reportedly a javelin or arrow, under his arm, where his armor left him exposed as he raised his arm during the fighting. He had reportedly said he would not leave the walls. He did not. The fall of Acre is one of the defining catastrophes of medieval history, the moment when 2 centuries of European military presence in the Holy Land ended not in a negotiated retreat, but in the destruction of the city itself. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil had besieged Acre with an enormous army beginning in April 1291, and the city, with a population estimated at more than 40,000, became the site of desperate last-stand fighting as the outer walls were breached and the Mamluk forces pushed into the city street by street. De Beaujeu had served as Grand Master since 1273 and had spent 18 years watching the Crusader position contract to this final point. When told to retreat as the walls were collapsing, contemporary accounts record that he gestured to show he was already mortally wounded and was carried from the battlements, dying shortly afterward. The Templars held the last fortified position in the city, their massive compound near the harbor, for days after the outer walls fell, providing cover for the evacuation of civilians to ships. Thousands died in the water trying to reach those ships. The Templar Tower eventually collapsed, reportedly with defenders still inside, after Mamluk forces tunneling under it caused it to fall. De Beaujeu's death on the wall, refusing retreat, is the last military act of the crusading era conducted as the Templars understood their mission, defending the Holy Land with their bodies until their bodies gave out. After Acre, there was no more Holy Land to defend. Jacques de Molay. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was burned alive on a small island in the Seine River in Paris on March 18th, 1314, on a slow fire built deliberately low to extend the dying. And from those flames, according to tradition, he cursed both King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V, summoning them before God's judgment within the year. Philip IV died on November 29th, 1314. Clement V had already died on April 20th, 1314. Whether or not the curse was real, the timing has fascinated historians for 7 centuries. De Molay had been Grand Master since 1292 and had spent the years after the fall of Acre navigating the Order's increasingly impossible position, a military brotherhood whose entire purpose had been the defense of the Holy Land, now headquartered in Cyprus with no land left to defend, increasingly viewed by European monarchs as a wealthy, untaxable, papally protected institution that had outlived its usefulness. Philip IV of France was deeply in debt to the Templars and deeply interested in their assets. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, the Friday the 13th, whose connection to bad luck may or may not derive from this event, though historians debate the direct link. Philip's agents arrested Templars simultaneously across France in a single coordinated sweep. Nearly the entire French membership was taken before dawn. Under torture, de Molay and other leaders confessed to a catalog of supposed heresies: denial of Christ during initiation ceremonies, spitting on the cross, obscene kisses, the worship of an idol called Baphomet, and sodomy. Modern historians regard these charges as almost certainly fabricated or coerced, the product of torture applied to men who had no way to resist it. De Molay later recanted his confession, which under church law made him a relapsed heretic and eligible for execution. The trial dragged across nearly 7 years, running through papal commissions, royal pressure, and the Council of Vienne in 1312, which formally dissolved the order, not condemned it, but dissolved it, a legal distinction that reflected the political complexity of destroying an institution that had served the church for nearly 2 centuries. De Molay was approximately 70 years old when he was brought to the scaffold on the Ile de Javiot, an island in the Seine with the towers of Notre Dame visible on the Paris skyline. He was not in armor, he was in chains. The man who had led the most famous military order in Christendom died not on a battlefield in the Holy Land, but on a stage constructed by a French king who wanted his money, watched by a Parisian crowd, burned slowly enough that death did not come quickly. Reports suggest he died with composure. The order he led was gone. The Crusades were effectively over. The age that had produced both was ending, and Jacques de Molay ended with it. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.